The instructions are clear. Let me write story B as clean, continuous prose. The parking lot was half empty by the time I pulled in, which should have been my first warning. My name is Miriam. I was 32 years old that November, and I had driven 40 minutes in the dark to drop off Thanksgiving gifts for a family that had already started celebrating without me. The text had arrived that morning, my mother's name across the top of the screen, her message below it, clipped and businesslike: gathering canceled, money is tight, don't make the trip. I had responded with a simple understood and spent 2 hours wrapping things anyway, because I am that kind of person. Or I was then. I put the bottles of wine and the handmade preserves and the card I had written in the passenger seat and drove to the house where I grew up. But the house was lit from every window. I could see the silhouettes behind the curtain, the flicker of someone raising a glass. I walked up the porch steps quietly, the way you do when you're not sure what you're about to find, and the front door was cracked an inch, just enough for sound to carry. My mother's voice first, warm and theatrical, then my sister Dana's laugh, high and satisfied. And then the words that arrived like a diagnosis, so much easier without Miriam here, honestly. My mother's agreement came back immediately, dry and fond. I had my hand on the door when the grip closed around my elbow from behind. My husband Theo pulled me back into the shadow of the porch, his mouth close to my ear. He is a healthcare compliance attorney, not given to impulse, and his voice was the voice he uses when the situation is genuinely serious. Not yet, he said. Let me show you what I found. We sat in his car at the end of the block for 40 minutes while he walked me through what he had been quietly assembling for the past 3 weeks. Theo had noticed inconsistencies in the financial reports from the 2 regional wellness clinics I had spent 5 years building. My parents, my father Gerald, and my mother Sandra, had been running day-to-day operations for 18 months, an arrangement that had felt at the time like trust. The revenue numbers had been declining without any corresponding drop in patient volume. Theo had cross-referenced the operational expense reports with the vendor payment logs and found a constellation of irregularities: maintenance contracts with companies that had no verifiable address, recurring invoices from a biomedical supply vendor that appeared nowhere in our equipment records. Gerald had been the authorizing signature on all of it. The amounts individually were modest enough to escape casual review. In aggregate, over 18 months they were not modest at all. I already knew, sitting in that dark car, where the money had gone. Dana had been drowning in debt for 2 years, not quietly, not privately, but with the particular recklessness of someone who has always believed a rescue is coming. She owed money to people who sent formal notices, and to people who did not. My parents had decided, apparently without consultation, that my clinics were the appropriate source of her rescue. Theo kept his hand on my arm while I processed this. He reminded me, gently but precisely, that confronting them at the front door would accomplish nothing except allowing them to frame me as unstable. We needed documentation. We needed time. The following morning, I sat at the kitchen table, while Theo pulled every financial record from the clinic management system: vendor payments, payroll logs, insurance reimbursements, expense approvals going back 22 months. It took most of the day. By evening, the picture was complete and unambiguous. Gerald had created the fictitious vendors himself, using billing addresses that were vacant lots and post office boxes in neighboring counties. He had routed the payments through 3 separate accounts before the money landed, reliably in a fund that paid Dana's creditors. Theo built the documentation file with the methodical calm of someone who has done this in professional contexts many times. He printed everything, organized it chronologically, cross-referenced the amounts against Dana's known debts using records his office had obtained through a separate inquiry. When it was done, he put it in a locked case and told me to wait. 3 days later, Sandra called to tell me she and Gerald needed to discuss a business matter. She used that phrase, business matter, as if we were colleagues, as if the last 18 months had been a professional arrangement she was now prepared to renegotiate. We agreed to meet at a restaurant near the hospital district. I arrived first. I watched them come in together, Gerald's hand at Sandra's back, both of them dressed carefully, wearing the particular expression of people who have rehearsed what they plan to say. They ordered coffee they didn't touch. Gerald delivered the proposal. They had identified an opportunity: a private healthcare investment fund, a chance for all of us to build something meaningful together. He slid a folded paper across the table with a number written on it. The number matched, almost to the dollar, the most recent balance on Dana's largest outstanding debt. I looked at it for a moment, then looked at him. I asked, very simply, where the revenue from the past quarter had gone. I mentioned the Meadowfield biomedical invoices. I mentioned the Crestline maintenance contract. I watched Gerald's rehearsed calm disassemble in real time. And I watched Sandra stop meeting my eyes. They tried several approaches in sequence: the economic climate, a systems error, a misunderstanding about authorization. When none of those held, Sandra raised her voice, and Gerald followed, and within 4 minutes they were telling me I was cold, that I had always been cold, that whatever I thought I had found it in bad faith. I picked up my bag and walked out. That evening, Theo and I made the calls we had already planned to make. Our annual foundation dinner was 10 days away, a formal event at the hotel downtown, attended by our clinical partners, our major donors, our most senior staff. I called Sandra and told her I had been too hasty at lunch. I told her I wanted to make things right. I invited all 3 of them to the dinner as guests of honor, and I told her that I would have a check prepared for them there. Her voice changed completely. By the end of the call, she was telling me I had always been generous, that she had always said so. The night of the dinner, Gerald and Sandra and Dana arrived in clothes they could not afford, moving through the room with the particular confidence of people who believe they have already won. Dana was laughing too loudly near the bar. Gerald was introducing himself to our clinical partners as an operational co-founder of the practice. I watched from across the room and felt nothing I would describe as anger. When I took the podium, I invited my family to come forward. They came up together, smiling. I told the room that I wanted to share something that had shaped my understanding of what it means to build something. And then I nodded to Theo, and the display screen behind me came to life with the vendor records, the routing logs, the invoice trail, organized and labeled with the care of someone had spent years doing exactly this kind of documentation work. The room went very quiet. What followed is not something I will reconstruct in detail. Sandra put her hand over her mouth. Gerald demanded the screen be turned off. Dana left first, without a word, her face set in the expression of someone calculating what comes next. Gerald and Sandra followed through the side exit, and the room held its silence for another few seconds before the sound of other conversations slowly resumed. They came to the house the next morning before 7. I watched them on the security monitor, Gerald at the door, Sandra behind him, both of them escalating steadily from knocking to pounding to something I can only describe as pleading dressed as rage. I had already called Theo's office. Within an hour, his associate had served them with a formal cease and desist. The civil complaint for financial fraud and defamation followed within the week. Dana called me from 3 different numbers over the following 10 days. I did not answer any of them. My oldest friend Renata came and sat with me through the worst of it when the social media posts went up and the mutual relatives started sending messages full of incomplete information. She took my phone out of my hand and put it in the kitchen drawer and made me eat something. That is the kind of friend worth having. The legal resolution took 4 months. My parents were removed from any operational role in the clinics. The funds that could be recovered were recovered. Dana's debts became, finally and properly, Dana's problem. I changed my number and sent a single brief message to the relevant family members explaining that I wished everyone well and would not be in contact. There is a small thing I did for myself in the spring. I put a deposit down on a studio apartment near the harbor, a place that belongs only to me, where I go when I need to think in rooms that carry no one else's history. It is unremarkable in every way except that it is entirely mine. I find that unremarkable things, when they are entirely yours, begin to feel extraordinary. Have you ever held something you built, a business, a family role, a version of yourself, and asked honestly who it was actually built for? The people who took from me were not villains in any complicated sense. They were simply people who had decided, long before I noticed, that my usefulness to them was more important than my existence apart from them. The accounting fraud was the last item in a much longer ledger. If you have ever been asked to be someone's solution rather than their person, What was the moment you finally understood the difference?